All right, here's how you develop velocity without obsessing over it so much. So we're gonna go over this. We're gonna go over strength, size, and volume. So if you wanna develop velocity without obsessing over too much, there are 3 characteristics and components that we use here at FSP, which is strength, size, and volume. These are gonna be the things that we measure the most. So the first one being strength is gonna be global versus local. So what that means is global strength is, right, our bench press, our deadlift, our, heavy reverse lunge, squat, whatever that is. And our local strength is gonna be the strength of our rotator cuff, forearm muscles, things like that that are a little bit on the smaller size, but make a massive difference. Then we've got size, which is gonna be muscular versus skinny. So when we're talking about muscular, we're talking about lean muscle mass, or you've got your guys who are big and bulky, or you've got skinny, the dudes who clearly need to put on 10, 20, 30 more pounds of weight, depending where they're at in their development. And of course, at the end, volume. So throwing volume, the number of throws we're making, and then lifting, the amount that our body is able to actually handle when we're in the weight room. So when it comes to our strength, if we're talking about global strength, that's gonna be things like our deadlifts, our bench press, and our squat. And that could be squat variations, right? Box squat, back squat, split squat. But the reason, aside from things like a split squat, that we're looking at deadlift, bench press, and squatting variations, these are bilateral movements that you can easily do a 1 to 3 rep max on without doing anything wild and compensating. If we do a 1 rep max on reverse lunge, sure, maybe time and a place, but it's unilateral and there are too many components for you to mess things up. If we're going with the deadlift, right, you're on 2 legs and you're pulling straight from the ground. So we're gonna be able to see how much power can you produce from the ground up. With bench press, how much are you actually able to load your internal rotators through max strength? And then with squatting, we're gonna see squatting patterns, be able to actually put up a ton of weight going in that way. Then we get to local strength. So like I said earlier, this is like rotator cuff, forearm strength, anything that we're going through, maybe internal rotation, external rotation, scaption, and then I'm just gonna put forearm just because that clearly there's a lot of different movements we're gonna go through there. But if we're primarily looking at local strength, I'm gonna look at an athlete's internal rotation, their external rotation, scaption, and then all the way through the forearm being radial and ulnar deviation, pronation, supination, and flexion and extension. So again, I'm not gonna write all of that here, that's kind of ridiculous. But global versus local strength, we have seen tons of guys who come in, they can deadlift 500 some pounds, they can bench press over 200, and they can squat variate, maybe like box squat, they can do 400, 500 pounds. But their local strength sucks. And the reason that they're not throwing very hard is because, yeah, sometimes they're just not as explosive even with those high numbers, but a lot of times it's because their local strength, their cuff, their forearm, everything is buns. It's weak, it's terrible. And we've seen guys who come in with really good local strength and really bad global strength. And what we see from that is we might have a pitcher who in the first inning is 90 to 93. In the second inning, he's 89 to 91. And then after that, he starts dropping to 86, 88, all the way down to 84, 87. Somewhere in those ranges, I'm obviously making up some of those numbers and my handwriting is really bad. But regardless, we see good local strength, bad global strength. They're unable to actually keep up throughout the game because they're not very strong. Then as we get here into our size, this is pretty simple stuff. Guys who have good muscle mass, whether that be lean or they're bulked up, they generally don't get injured as quickly and they have the ability to actually produce tons of force, both globally and locally, so it allows them to actually throw a baseball harder. So we're not focusing so much on, every day we're doing massive pull downs, we're doing max long toss, we're throwing weighted balls or underload balls as hard as we can. We're not spending a bunch of useless time on that because every throwing session is time and wasted time is just wasted reps. So when it comes to size, the skinny guys, again, 1%ers, if you're watching this video, more than likely, no offense, you're not a 1% guy. You're probably not that dude who's 160 pounds throwing 90. Happens, but it's very rare. But if we're going through this, the guys who are the most muscular tend to throw the hardest, whether that be lean muscle mass or actually bulking up. The guys who have issues with their weight, they can't gain weight, meaning they just don't want to eat, or they simply just come in underdeveloped, right? They're very, very unlikely to actually throw a baseball hard, and they're usually the guys that obsess over it the most. So then after we get out of size, we get volume. This is the most important part. If you can throw really hard, but you don't have a lot of volume built up where you're actually throwing, you're gonna run into problems with arm pain, with durability. People talk about like the first example, right? If a guy's going, 90 to 93 in the first inning, he drops all the way down to 84 in the last inning, well, he probably doesn't have a lot of throwing volume built under his belt. And if that's the case, that gets very dangerous very fast, especially as you throw harder, because every throw you make that's 1 mile an hour harder is only 1 time more stressful, right? And once you start breaking that 85 mile an hour barrier, especially getting into 90 plus, that's a whole different ball game. So guys who bounce back from a 78 mile an hour arm injury versus an 88 mile an hour arm injury, very different. So we have to actually build up the tolerance to throw a lot, which means in catch play, we're making on a recovery day like 50 throws. Moderate day, we're making somewhere between 60 to 80. And on another day, maybe we're just trying to really build up volume, you can go all the way up to 120. And that sounds like a lot, but 120 can include your plyo throws too, which sometimes could be anywhere from 10 all the way up to 40 of those throws. Then our lifting volume, if you're not lifting frequently enough, you are putting yourself in a position where you're just not gonna actually be able to develop any velocity. This is probably one of the most important things to developing velocity, if not the most. That's why here at FSP, lifting is the biggest staple in our program. So if I'm ranking things in terms of how you're gonna throw harder, I would put volume as number 1. I would put strength as number 2. Sorry for my handwriting. And then I would put size as number 3. The reason being is because if we build up a lot of volume, we're able to actually do more. If we have a good amount of strength, we're able to produce the power. And if we have the size, we're able to utilize the power of our strength. Again, 1%ers exist. Likely you're not one of them. So if you're a guy watching this video and you're 160 pounds and you throw 90 and you comment, well, whatever I just said, tough, because a lot of people are not like you. A lot of people are gonna be 150 pounds, 6 foot, and they throw 78 to 82. That's why so many guys are stuck in that low 80s range and they can't get out of that plateau. So if you wanna develop velocity without obsessing over velocity during throwing sessions, focus on your strength, build up your size, and increase the amount of volume that your body's able to handle.